This is Green Street, the environmental health show. GreenStreetNews.org, Patti and Doug Wood, and our worldwide network of experts here every week to help you navigate your way through this increasingly toxic world. Welcome back. It's funny how we come to believe certain things about the world we live in. Propaganda can be powerful, and the control of knowledge can impact what people believe to be true. And in the world of big business and big profits, the intentional distribution and promotion of misleading scientific information can protect those profits, even while it puts the health of the public at risk. Today on Green Street, we're going to replay a show we did last fall and a conversation we had with a scientific researcher who has uncovered documents showing how the powerful sugar industry has manipulated science and promoted the idea that you could eat as much sugar as you wanted so long as your water was fluoridated.
Sugar is not good for you, full stop. It contributes to weight gain, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, dental cavities, and many other health problems. But it's a very profitable product, pulling in almost $40 billion just last year. So over the years, the sugar industry has been busy trying to play down its harms and, it seems, promoting ideas that were not entirely based on scientific fact. A recent article published in Environmental Health examined records dating as far back as the 1930s and found evidence that the sugar industry used manipulation tactics to downplay sugar's health harms and promote fluoride as a safe solution to tooth decay. Doug and I had a chance to speak to the author of that article, Chris Neurath, who serves as the research director of the Fluoride Action Network and the American Environmental Health Studies Project. We began our conversation talking about why most people have never heard about this. Here's our conversation with Chris Neurath.
I think the reason you hadn't heard about it was because nobody had really looked into the sugar industry with the recently available documents, which really only became available maybe 8 or 9 years ago. And that was through Kristen Kearns, a dentist, who got suspicious when she went to a meeting and they were talking about diabetes, and the kidney people were saying sugar is not a problem with diabetes, and she couldn't believe it. And she started looking into it. She ended up digging up all these records from the sugar industry from the 30s, 40s, 50s, and published a paper showing how the sugar industry deflected from the role that sugar plays in heart disease and intentionally pushed the narrative that it's cholesterol and dietary fat, which took hold. And only very recently is it being acknowledged that sugar does play a role. And basically, there was one champion, a Dr. Ansel Keys, who championed the dietary fat theory starting in the 50s. And he was funded by the sugar industry secretly. Most of his work, he never revealed that the sugar industry was paying for his work. And so some of the documents she uncovered were, letters, memos that were never, they were all confidential, of the Sugar Industry Foundation mostly, talking about, this will help us and that sort of stuff. Anyways, when I saw that, it sparked my interest in, I wonder, people have always been suspicious that the sugar industry may have played a role in promoting fluoridation for the obvious reason that, I don't know if it's a belief, but it's sometimes stated outright that, hey, if you have fluoride, you don't have to worry anymore.
That's right.
It is like the silver bullet against cavities. Go ahead, keep eating your candy, sugary desserts, everything else, sugary cereals.
So this was a conscious pattern by the sugar industry. This didn't just happen by accident. This was a concerted
what
effort,
the evidence.
Right?
The evidence shows it was intentional, and the strongest evidence comes from letters and memos and internal documents of what's called the Sugar Research Foundation, which was started in 1942, and fluoridation had not started yet. And The most incriminating documents are between the science director, his name is Robert Hockett, he was a chemist from MIT, and their PR person, and actually several PR people. And the PR people ended up being the exact same people who led the cigarette industry campaign to defend themselves about 10 years later when the link to lung cancer first was being publicly discussed.
Yeah.
And the cigarette industry started the Tobacco Research Industry Committee, which was almost patterned after the Sugar Research Foundation. And they hired Robert Hockett, who had been the director of the sugar, to be their assistant science director. And what's amazing is his resume letter, his cover letter for his resume, which he sent to them the same day he saw the ad that they were looking for somebody to help with this project. And it was done by Hill and Knowlton,
Right.
one of the biggest Madison Avenue PR firms that, of course, cigarette industry and many other industries making bad things use. And in that cover letter, he says, my 10 years of experience defending sugar from claims that it, increases obesity, diabetes, heart disease, tooth decay, put me in a great position. I have the experience. We got science, to help with us. We funded scientists. I spoke at doctors and wrote articles. And basically he says, we did such a great job defending sugar.
Yeah.
That I'm the perfect person. And
We know how to do
hired
this,
him,
right?
and he stayed with them for 30 years and was one of the main tobacco defenders.
Wow.
So getting back to the sugar industry, how did they get the word out to the dental profession and get them all on board about fluoride?
There's this amazing memo from, I think it's 1944 or 45. And again, this is before fluoridation had ever started. It's a memo from his PR person, sort of his sidekick. His name is Weiss Mork, who had previously been the PR consultant for the American Dental Association. And his father was a prominent dentist in New York City. And he was a PR person, and his beginning of his career was working for the American Dental Association. And there's this letter between him and Robert Hockett, the director of the Sugar Research Foundation, saying, we have debated the tooth decay issue at length. We have, this has been our trickiest thing because everybody knew that sugar is going to cause cavities, eating a lot of sugar.
Yeah.
That was something they had a very hard time denying. And they said, we have worked on this and worked, all these angles. But finally, I think we've got the right angle. We've got the right message. Fluorine is it.
Wow.
Okay.
Wow.
Soon after this memo saying, they'd thought long and hard about it, fluorine is it, they started acting on that. And one of the most amazing things was Weiss Mork organized a symposium in New York City that was attended by 1,000 people, mostly dentists, about fluoridation. Now, again, this is before there was any fluoridation.
Okay.
And he got all the top dental people who were at that point starting to talk about fluoride and fluoridation as a possibility, and who would go on to be the main promoters of fluoridation for the next several decades. And the Sugar Research Foundation paid for this symposium, but that was never mentioned.
Nobody knew it.
Nobody knew it was the Sugar Research Foundation that was funding this symposium. Furthermore, it was put on by the New York State Oral Pathology Group that his father was a prominent member of. So that was, presumably how he got that going. The proceedings, which is, 100 pages or so, of basically a transcript of each of the presentations, was printed up into a book and sent to 100,000 dentists and public health officials throughout the United States at no cost, and never a mention that this was funded by the sugar industry.
So, Chris, fluoride is a toxic byproduct, and it's a real liability for lots of other industries. I'm guessing that they were also behind this effort to identify fluoride as a health solution. Is that right?
Oh, yeah. There becomes a connection with the other industries which have been shown to be fluoridation promoters because they're defending their pollution. And this is the aluminum industry, chemical industries, phosphate fertilizer industries, and the steel industries, among others. And are you familiar with Christopher Bryson's book called The Fluoride Deception?
No.
He was a BBC reporter and started finding documents connecting these industries, which had, especially back then, because pollution control just didn't exist, their factories were spewing out fluoride, and it was harming people, crops, livestock, workers. And this was mostly air pollution, but some water pollution too. And that was going back to the early 1900s, but it was especially became much worse. World War II, the aluminum industry took off. They were making airplanes like crazy, and they were making aluminum like crazy, and they didn't want to spend the time and money to control the pollution. So it became a real problem. And then the other thing that happened in World War II was the Manhattan Project. And it was secret, but a key ingredient, a necessary ingredient, was fluoride. Because to enrich uranium, one of the primary ways you do it is using uranium hexafluoride gas. And you can do it with centrifuges or with gaseous diffusion. And Oak Ridge, Tennessee is where they were doing both of those methods. I think gaseous diffusion is the one they use the most. But, when you hear about the Iraq nuclear program and centrifuges, well, that's because that's a basic way to enrich uranium enough to make it possible to make a weapon from it.
Wow.
And that's what the Manhattan Project was doing. And they were using incredible amounts of, fluoride, but also energy. I mean, they had, tens of thousands of people there, including Harold Hodge, who is the chief toxicologist for the Manhattan Project, and who went on to be the leading scientific advocate for fluoridation. Now, during the Manhattan Project, he and others realized that all this fluoride they were using was a hazard to the workers. They also found out the pollution that was going on to farmers' fields in nearby areas. The farmers were threatening lawsuits. And that was a problem because it was top secret what this fluoride was going to. But mostly he was worried about the workers being harmed. And as a toxicologist, he was assigned to figure out, what level of exposure is okay, how do we protect the workers, et cetera, et cetera. He did all these animal testing, and then he started doing human testing. And he was finding problems with it, and that the humans were affected. And one of the most interesting things was he started finding evidence of neurotoxicity. And he asked to do an animal study to check on this. And this is all top secret documents, which Christopher Bryson uncovered in his research from the Manhattan Project. It looks like that study never happened, or the results were never recorded or were destroyed. It's not clear. But back in the 1940s, the lead toxicologist who was focused on studying the toxicity of fluoride had at least suspicions based on some evidence that it was a neurotoxic. So, we are now 80 years later, and neurotoxicity is now the current big concern. But in the meantime, it was totally hidden. All this was top secret, but it connects back to the sugar industry. And I said this is sort of a distraction, but it's important to know because his book lays out in at least as much detail as mine all this evidence he found, which is very convincing that these industries realized, it's very specific. There was a meeting, and we have the meeting minutes, in 1945 or 46, where Harold Hodge was there and General Leslie Groves, the head of the entire Manhattan Project, all their top people are saying we're starting to get lawsuits from farmers from fluoride. This is a huge problem because the atomic arms race was just getting started, and they knew they were going to be polluting even more with fluoride. They didn't want to have any restrictions. I mean, this was national security. This was an existential thing.
Yeah.
So they wanted to find a way to tamp down whatever this idea that fluoride was harming people and crops and things. And Harold Hodge pipes up and in this meeting and says, if we promoted this idea that fluoridation prevents tooth decay, that could be a good way to, and this is more in lines of the PR aspect, selling the public, and he suggested it, and he went on and did that.
Chris, there were certainly scientists that were doing some research on sugar, right, and its effects. Were they discredited? Was that part of the plan as well?
No, the sugar industry knew they could not deny that sugar was a risk for caries.
Sure.
What their goal was find an antidote to sugar. Basically, you can have your cake.
Sure, you can have your sugar.
As long as as long as the water's fluoridated, you don't have to worry about sugar causing cavities.
Brilliant. It's a brilliant strategy.
I want to fast forward to 2025, where if you Google, fluoridation and major public health achievement, both the CDC, the NIH, they're all saying community water fluoridation, one of CDC's top great public health achievements of the 20th century. They're still saying it, all of these organizations and these agencies. And so this is what people get about fluoride. They don't hear anything about what you're talking about.
No, and as far as this early history, it's because nobody knew. Nobody had ever looked and found these things. But these documents have only been available for 10 years, or maybe less, a lot of them. Just to complete the circle, I'm gonna go back to these symposiums and the Manhattan Project and the sugar industry. Just because it's such a bizarre twist. And again, this is the early history. As far as currently, by the 50s, the ADA and the Public Health Service and all those CDC, they had become fully on board. And ever since then, they have been the champions. And these industries, sugar, chemical, aluminum, they haven't had to do anything.
Yeah.
They stay behind the scenes. Mm-hmm. They keep themselves hidden. And that's always been the plan. So a few months before the sugar industry had their symposium on fluoride, the Manhattan Project sponsored an almost identical symposium in New York City, but they invited all the industry people who were having concerns about, the fluoride pollution, this whole fluoride issue. And they never told them it was being sponsored by the Manhattan Project. Basically, it was a front group was the U.S. Public Health Service. And there's all the documents showing that they were the sponsors of this, but they only invited, the industry doctors, the industry medical people, the heads of these industries, all these polluting industries. And almost all the talk was, about occupational disease from fluoride and trying to set, what is the limit we should have for the air exposures and things like that. And at the end, they had a little committee meeting, of their own people, and they set an interim one, which is what the Manhattan Project used. And they were consciously saying, we've got to make this so that we can still do the work that has to be done. We can't set this so protective that it shuts down our operations or it costs us too much time and money.
Chris, I actually heard once that there was a connection between sugar and cigarettes. Can you talk a little bit about that? I mean, is that really true?
Modern cigarettes developed around the turn of the century depend on sugar. It makes, apparently, I'm not a smoker, but apparently it makes the smoke more alkaline, which is much easier on the throat and lungs. Without the sugar altering the chemistry of the smoke, it is way too acrid, acidic, whatever, and you do not inhale the smoke. And by the 30s or 40s, in the tobacco industry and in the sugar industry, it was known that this was necessary so that the smoke you could inhale, the inhaled smoke gave a much more potent nicotine hit, making them more addictive. Now, it also makes them more carcinogenic. Cigarettes, have been linked to lung cancer, incredibly strong link. So the epidemic of lung cancer, heart disease that modern cigarettes have caused wouldn't happen without sugar. The sugar industry and the tobacco industry were well aware of that.
Wow.
And there's an amazing book called Golden Holocaust, which reveals all of this and much, much more. The tobacco industry, the sugar industry, the Manhattan Project, all these other chemical industries, they're terrible. But the tobacco industry takes it even further.
Unbelievable. So how do you feel about the future here? I know that you are hoping that your article will get more people to question the science around this. Are you hopeful for the future?
Yes, but speaking of the future, we focused on the beginnings of fluoridation, where I think the sugar industry played the largest, most important role. Fluoridation might have happened without them pushing. I mean, the dentists loved the idea that there was something that was a magic bullet. Mm-hmm. The sugar industry is still promoting, but more actually, these days defending fluoridation. And they're doing it through, a different way, because the biggest threat to fluoridation right now is the neurotoxicity. So it continues through the present day. And I wanted to expose that. I'm hoping people will recognize this isn't just the obesity epidemic, diabetes, and heart disease, which are the chronic disease epidemics, which many people on all sides totally agree with that. Sugar plays a huge role, and a big reason sugar plays a role is because the sugar industry profits from it. And the same thing goes with fluoridation, but I'm hoping people will become more aware of how moneyed interests are causing these public health threats, basically.
Chris Neurath, Research Director of the Fluoride Action Network and the American Environmental Health Studies Project, talking about the sugar industry's long and successful campaign to promote fluoride and play down the harms of sugar. You can find links to Chris's article and all of our news items on our program website, greenstreetnews.org, where you can also find our contact information if you have a question or comment about the show. We'd love to hear from you. That's going to do it for this edition of Green Street. Patti and I will be back next week with another edition of the show. Thanks for listening.